Good morning and welcome to Morning Joe. It is Thursday, July 3rd, and you are looking at live pictures from the floor of the House of Representatives, where congressional Republicans are now pushing toward a final vote on President Trump's sweeping domestic policy bill. Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries there speaking what is known as a magic minute, where leadership can speak essentially for as long as it wants to, much longer than a minute, of course. When he finishes, the House will proceed to the final vote on the so-called Big Beautiful Bill. Speaker Mike Johnson, with a big assist from President Trump overnight, got to this point when, after an all-night session, the chamber voted 219 to 213 to adopt a rule governing debate on the legislation. That opens up discussion and then tees up this coming final vote on the package. A group of hardline conservatives and moderate Republicans had combined forces earlier in the evening to stall the bill, raising their protests. And Speaker Johnson held the vote open for 5 hours as he worked to garner support. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, President Trump called those holdouts directly, then fired off a handful of social media posts calling for Republicans to get the legislation passed. Democrats have continued to rally against this bill, with some Republicans who flipped to yes votes after some persuasion defending their positions. Congressman Derek Van Orden of Wisconsin pushed back at a suggestion Republicans will do whatever Trump asks of them.
Am I happy about everything? No. But there's a difference between compromise and capitulation. We're not capitulating. We're compromising. The President of the United States didn't give us an assignment. It's not a bunch of little Okay, I'm a member of Congress. I represent almost 800,000 Wisconsinites. Is that clear?
Some tough talk from the congressman there. Let's bring in the host of Way Too Early, Ali Vitale, NBC News congressional correspondent Julie Surkin, and MSNBC political analyst Brendan Buck. He was communications strategist and former aide to House Speakers Paul Ryan and John Boehner. Good morning to you all. Brendan, I want to start with you because of your experience with Paul Ryan and with Boehner, the two speakers of the House, and just about what happened overnight, how this sort of negotiation goes. You didn't generally have a president with the sway, let's say, of Donald Trump to call directly these members and say, vote for my package or else, despite some of the protests we heard, at least from one congressman there. That's basically what happened. So describe a little bit about what was happening overnight that brought us to this moment where we expected now Republicans will have the votes to pass this big bill.
Yeah, well, obviously, Mike Johnson had a big hill to climb yesterday. After the Senate did what they did, you had a lot of members, particularly both sides of the conference. You had moderates who didn't like what the Senate had done in terms of cutting more deeply into Medicaid, and you had a lot of conservatives who said this is still just too expensive, and I'm not going to vote for it. And that all melted away really quickly, but not quite enough where they had the votes at the time they needed it last night. There was a key procedural vote that basically sets the terms for debate last night, and they rolled the dice, and it was a bit of a gambit by Mike Johnson to say, look, we don't have the votes right now, we're close, but we're going to go for it. And you do that every once in a while in the Speaker's office. You say, we're short, but we're going to use the pressure of the floor to try to break some members. Of course, having Donald Trump to help break them as well is useful. They kept the vote open for a really long time overnight, and eventually Donald Trump, I guess, made enough assurances that he was going to instill some fiscal responsibility going forward. That was enough for some of these conservatives. I don't know what the promises were. I don't know how realistic they are. At this point, when they realize that this is going to pass some way or another, you kind of have members who want to be lied to a little bit. Tell me what I need to hear to be okay with this, and ultimately, after a long, painful night, they did that. And so it seems like they're on a glide path now. But some credit to Mike Johnson for basically saying, we're going to use this July 4th deadline. Nobody thinks we're going to be able to pull this off, but I am going to insist on it. We're going to put this on the floor and we're going to pass it. Having Donald Trump, again, hanging over your shoulder makes that a little easier to do. But I think credit to him for believing that this could be done and forging ahead when people doubted him.
And so, Julie Surkin, that vote was left open, as I mentioned, for 5 hours by Speaker Johnson, which means during those 5 hours, he's twisting arms. Donald Trump is getting involved. Vice President Vance is making phone calls to his friends on the Hill and trying to get some of those members of the Freedom Caucus, some of those moderates who have misgivings about this big package, to come along to their side. And they did that. But here's the thing. The substance of the bill didn't change. So what did overnight for those members who flipped from no's to yes?
The reality that if they voted against this bill, they would face President Trump's hammer, essentially, and the power that comes with him. The message that we kept hearing all day long from Republican leadership was, I wouldn't want to be the member that stands in front of Donald Trump and the 77 million people that voted for him. And obviously, as we've been following all year long, as we followed in the first administration, but this has just increased this time around, his pressure is real, and it has worked. And it is working now with a group of Republicans in the House who have sworn up and down that they would never vote to increase the deficit, that they would never vote to raise the debt ceiling, that they would never vote for a bill that doesn't cut spending by $2 trillion. None of that is happening with this piece of legislation. I think Brendan is exactly right. Mike Johnson does deserve a tremendous amount of credit for essentially telling us months ago, we're going to get this through, setting that arbitrary deadline of July 4th, keeping the pressure on, and of course, starting this whole thing out by saying it's going to be one big, beautiful bill and not two like the Senate had wanted to address some of the concerns at the border and other items. And instead, they managed to get a bill that the Senate had changed, that it had at the last minute essentially weakened and softened some of the Medicaid provisions, including that rural hospital fund that, of course, cut even more of what this bill was able to save. And they made some changes on the clean energy tax credits. The Senate kind of played this beautifully as well, with Leader Thune essentially making this bill a little bit more conservative at first and then watering it down to try and get those moderates like Lisa Murkowski on board. Ultimately, in the end, the House Freedom Caucus here folding on this issue, I think, is a big marker of what's to come for the rest of the year and the lack of leverage that they will probably have moving forward in this process.
And Minority Leader Jeffries is talking right now about some of that hypocrisy that you just described on the debt. Let's listen in.
Tax breaks. It had been my hope, Mr. Speaker, that we'd be able to have a robust debate, passionate support or passionate opposition in connection with this bill, that hundreds of members on both sides of the aisle could participate in. Instead, we have a limited debate where the relevant committees of jurisdiction have been given 15 minutes each on a bill of such significant magnitude as it relates to the health, the safety, and the well-being of the American people. And because that debate was so limited, I feel the obligation, Mr. Speaker, to stand on this House floor and take my sweet time to tell the stories of the American people. And that's exactly what I intend to do. Take my sweet time on behalf of the American people, on behalf of their health care, on behalf of their Medicaid, on behalf of their nutritional assistance, on behalf of veterans, on behalf of farmers, on behalf of children, on behalf of seniors, on behalf of people with disabilities, on behalf of small businesses, on behalf of every single American. I'm on this House floor after 6 a.m. and I'm planning to take my sweet time. Without Medicaid, I wouldn't have made it. If I lost Medicaid, it would completely change my life. It would also severely affect my husband with epilepsy. Without Medicaid, he wouldn't be able to afford his seizure medications, which means he'd have seizures every week, like he did before. This would leave him unable to function or work, Before he had Medicaid, he'd have a seizure. And it would take him days to recover. His health is inconsistent, which makes it hard for him to hold down a job. I still have my house, my car, my husband, and my health. Thank God for that. But why should we have to struggle so hard just to live? In a country with so much wealth, I'm considered one of the lucky ones. And yet I still struggle to make ends meet for the basics. That's Maria, pouring her heart out to us as members of Congress about her struggles. She lives in Iowa's 1st Congressional District.
So that is Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries sharing personal anecdotes from voters about the potential impact of this bill if it does pass as expected a short time from now once the full vote is opened up. Ali Vitale, Minority Leader Jeffries saying, "I will take my sweet time," as he stands there to rousing applause from his Democratic colleagues, talking about what's in this bill and what will happen in this country as a result of its passage today.
Being told. So now you see the Speaker announcing the fact.
14. The motion is adopted. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
And look, this is how it was going to play out. They're going to do a motion to reconsider, which is a procedural step here that Democrats are going to try to say, hey, wait a second, we don't want to do that. But it's not going to pass because, again, the margins are the margins. You're going to see a lot of backslapping here from Republicans because, again, this is a victory lap.
And the final count was 218 to 214 with only 2 Republican defections.
That's exactly right. And again, it becomes also a story about the Democratic seats that are still open here because they have seen some deaths within their conference and those elections haven't taken place yet.
The House a communication.
But if, as Julie was talking about, he doesn't have the political capital, Mike Johnson, to do something like this again, Vaughn, where do we go next with this? And has the White House put its own agenda at risk by spending so much of its political capital, so much effort into getting this so-called big, beautiful bill to this moment right here so the president can have the photo op he wants tomorrow, signing it on the 4th of July?
There was no deadline. July 4th was a made-up deadline by this White House. And if anything, it means that their political capital here on the Republican side is going to be refilled. Effectively, being able to get through a reconciliation here in the middle of the summer is a huge win and achievement for them. If you go back to the Biden administration back in 2021, it took Democrats a lot of work to work through that process and then ultimately get to 2022. They kept running into hiccups. They were not able to get Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema wholly on board, and it really prevented them from making that sort of huge impact piece of legislation early on in 2021 when perhaps they had the popular vote and they had the recent electoral victories behind their backs. And that is where the president made it clear and was able to more effectively argue that the American people voted for this House, they voted for this Senate, and they voted for this White House. And therefore, they made the case that, yes, despite some narrow margins in some key states, that the American people had given them agenda to go and implement in Congress. And that is what they are making the case that they are doing here today in July of 2025. He is going to sign this into law. Tomorrow, there's going to be a fireworks celebration on the White House grounds or on the National Mall grounds. He is then going to likely head out of town. And then this Republican majority on Capitol Hill and the White House are going to be able to reset. He's going to be able to focus some of his attention to international diplomacy efforts, Of course, there has been much frustration on that front, but also on the trade front. We should expect here in the coming weeks him to actually set tariff rates for multiple countries. He had said 90 deals in 90 days. That has not come anywhere close to happening here. So if anything, this allows him to take his attention from what is happening down Pennsylvania Avenue and instead direct it more full time to his economic policy in terms of bilateral relations with other key trading partners and also potential peace efforts overseas. Those have really kind of got stuck in the cement over the last 6 months. And so for the president, you should expect him to go and celebrate this, even potentially hit the campaign trail effectively to try to tout these tax cuts here and really hone in on what he's going to tout as these accomplishments, focus on the deportation efforts here. If, in fact, they are able to ramp up the ICE personnel, there's going to be a hiring process to that, again, doubling the number of staff. They want to be able to detain more than 100,000 undocumented individuals on any given day at once, which is more than double what they are currently able to do at capacity right now. So, of course, this is all going to take a staggering bureaucratic actions. At the same time, for the president, I think when you're talking through the White House's eyes, their political capital could not be higher than it is right now than at any point it was since Inauguration Day.
And if you saw that slate pop up, that's because the vote is done. Final numbers were 218 to 214. The big, beautiful bill, as the president likes to call it, has passed. Joining us now, we've got NBC News senior business correspondent Christine Romans. Christine, you just heard Vaughn talking about the economic impact of not only this bill, but now the president can turn to this other outlying thing, which are these tariffs that he's negotiating all over the world. But, you know, we originally were going to have you on today to talk about the jobs report. I do want to talk about that a little bit because it seems like they are a tad related, because economists have talked about how concerned they are about the U.S. national debt, about bonds, about the faith of the credit of the United States. This bill is not helping that. So why aren't we seeing that in the jobs reports, which are so strong?
The jobs report is still strong. And, you know, I'm going to zero in on something that you guys have been talking about here, the healthcare part of the economy. That has been a consistent driver, honestly, for several years. Eds and meds is what the economists talk about, these parts of education and healthcare and the economy that have driven the economy so well. And now you've got all of this furious forecasting for what are these Medicaid cuts going to be to both rural healthcare and healthcare overall. You've got estimates up to 500,000 jobs could be lost because of those Medicare cuts, or Medicaid cuts, rather. And just look at it this way, and I think that this gets lost in the conversation, Christina. You know, Medicaid isn't a check that goes into someone's pocket. It's money that goes into the healthcare system that pays janitors and lab techs and doctors and nurses. You know what I mean? So there's going to be some constriction there that will filter through the economy. I think in the first case, that's where you'll see it very first. And then more broadly of the overall economy and investors around the world, you're absolutely right. We've seen those big moves in the dollar and in treasuries earlier this year simply because of concern that the U.S. is on an unsustainable path, and we're getting closer to that moment when international investors are going to say the U.S. is not the safe place we thought it was. It doesn't have predictable policies, and it is not getting its financial house in order. So that's the big picture concern over $3 trillion to $4 trillion in added debt because of this very, very big bill.
And as we wait for Speaker Mike Johnson to make some remarks there at the podium, Allie, what are your big takeaways from today? And I want to ask you very simply, do fiscal conservatives still exist?
If they do, please stand up. Honestly, because I had Congressman Dusty Johnson on 2 hours ago. Time is kind of a flat circle. And even in defending this bill, he still made the point that this country is in a national debt crisis that Republicans had an opportunity here to solve.
And this is something we heard when they were the minority over and over and over again.
Exactly right. And I posed that question back to him, and he said, OK, I'm open to dealing in bipartisan fashion with that. OK. That's fine. I have a big doubt that they're going to do that going into an election year. But look, I stand to be surprised. I think what's so surprising about the way that this came together, I actually think there's lessons in the way the Senate did this and the way the House did this, because it's actually two different stories. In the House, it's definitely a story about the power of President Trump not wanting to cross the MAGA agenda. Certainly, we see that with people like Ralph Norman, abandoning his deep concerns about the debt and fiscal responsibility and ultimately going along on this. But on the Senate side, it really does pose some questions for Republicans about what they could actually get for their constituents if they're willing to not just be swayed by the president. And that's the story of Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. She was criticized for that, the polar payoff, and yet her constituents will be slightly less harmed by this legislation that even Republicans like Murkowski say is far from perfect.
House Republicans, after some defections, have passed Trump's spending bill. This is that big budget clash we've been following. It heads to the president's desk, where Donald Trump will be signing it into law tomorrow. We have the nonpartisan estimates here. The CBO says the bill adds $3 trillion plus the deficit. It'll slash over $1 trillion from health care and Medicaid. 10 to 12 million Americans ultimately could be booted off their health coverage. Funnels a lot of money to ICE and border enforcement, 100B over there. Trump and Republicans are celebrating however tough this was, longer, slower, more defections than they wanted. Ultimately, as they say, a win is a win. They set out to pass this thing. They lost some votes along the way. They even had some parts of it stripped by the parliamentarian, but they won passage today. Not without a fight. House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries was on a warpath discussing the risks and the problems in the bill and doing what Democrats have done increasingly in the second Trump term, which is find different ways, sometimes symbolic, sometimes even physical, to get up and show that they're fighting and to command some attention even against Donald Trump, whose entire skill set is PR and attention. You're looking at some of the thunderous applause there as he continued on the record-breaking speech, 8-hour plus, the longest speech in the history of the United States House. This began around 5 a.m. this morning.
I rise today in strong opposition to Donald Trump's one big, ugly bill. This disgusting abomination, this reckless Republican budget is an immoral document. The largest cut to Medicaid in American history. The American people will not get over it, but they will get even next November. Extraordinary levels of corruption. Got some folks in this town, they go to church and they pray on Sunday. P-R-A-Y. And then they come to Congress and pray P-R-E-Y on the American people. I'm not down with that kind of faith. No matter what the outcome is on this singular day, we're going to press on. Press on for the rule of law. Press on for the American way of life. Press on for democracy. We're going to press on until victory is won. I yield back.
He yielded, but only after breaking the record. That marathon address went down pretty well, considering the Democrats are losing the budget battle here, which is expected. They don't have the same number of votes as Republicans. Some congressional math is just that. But you see here Leader Jeffries flanked by Democratic colleagues who seemed genuinely energized. Yes, politics is full of show, but you see here there was some real enthusiasm today about waging this battle any which way they could. The Democrats did not have the votes to stop the bill. There is no magic strength or strategy that was going to change that. It was only a question of whether Republicans were going to lose enough of their own. And they lost some in the Senate and ultimately 2 in the House. Now, Jeffries' intention was to force Republicans to also vote in the daytime Politico reports, using, again, the procedural levers they have to not stop the bill, but make sure that this still landed in the daylight with so many Republicans who are worried this is the kind of vote that might cost them their jobs if enough constituents realize what it does and what it does to health care, et cetera. The bill ultimately passing by 4 votes with, as mentioned, those 2 Republican defections. That is how we end the week going into American Independence Day weekend, and we're joined by Douglas Brinkley, presidential historian, Rice University professor, and Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist Eugene Robinson. Gene, your thoughts on what is now the ending of this round, the budget plan going to the White House tomorrow?
Well, look, this ended the way I always thought it would end in terms of the legislation being passed. The Republicans do have the majority in the Senate and the House, and Donald Trump wanted this this bill passed, this big bill. It is big, and so it was going to pass. I mean, that was going to happen. The unexpected note was Hakeem Jeffries' speech. His 8-hour plus speech was an extraordinary thing in the House, and it certainly did serve to cause this vote to be held in the daylight, and to bring attention on the fact that these majorities are very narrow in both the Senate and the House that Republicans have. And this is a deeply unpopular bill. When people learn what's in it, they don't like it at all. And so to that extent, to the extent it was possible for Democrats to be successful today, they were successful. They were not able to stop the passage of this legislation that they believe, and I believe, is going to hurt a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Professor Brinkley?
218 Republicans, 214 Democrats, as Eugene's pointing out. It's close. And that's what the next election is going to be all about. This is the opening. Tomorrow opens the election for 2026. There's just no doubt about it. There were shocks this week or tension-filled moments. I thought perhaps Lisa Murkowski, on the heels of a book coming out and the press she was getting, may have stood up to President Trump in a Profiles in Courage. I was at the JFK Library this year. They gave Profile in Courage award to Mike Pence. I thought Murkowski might be that person, but in the end, the fossil fuel industry controls her out of Alaska, and she didn't want to mess with them, and she didn't want to be the bane of all of the disdain from the MAGA world. So she folded her tent, and at that point, it seemed a foregone conclusion that it would get through Congress. I will say Mike Johnson seems to be delivering on what he needs to do. He did a prayer session. He huddled. Donald Trump then went and got on the phone, and they did what they needed to do to get this passed. But Johnson is now a significant speaker pulling this off.
Yeah, you mentioned that. I'm curious, Gene, because you followed this over so many eras. It does seem that the White House operation has learned over time that they are using the president's time and advocacy strategically, as Doug Brinkley just mentioned, that there are many extreme radical and indeed, according to many courts, unlawful activities by this White House. We actually cover that in the news frequently. But there's also a learning curve on this process, which, however controversial, is not illegal. Mm-hmm. This is not the abuse of federal forces or some other controversy we've covered. And it seems that in comparison to term one, they are more organized. And from what we can tell, the president is more engaged when called upon to deal with legislating something he's never shown a great personal interest in.
Yeah, they have definitely learned, and they have learned when the president should engage with directly with members of the House or the Senate. He's clearly learned how to do that. He's learned what buttons to push. They use both carrots and sticks. It was a lot of carrots with Murkowski, a lot of benefits for Alaska, a lot of sticks with some others, and they've learned that there are a few votes that they can just sort of write off. They weren't going to get Rand Paul in the Senate. They're not going to get Massey. Massey is always going to be a problem in the House, but they've learned a lot. And I agree with Doug. You have to say Mike Johnson is a much more effective Speaker of the House than certainly I expected him to be, and then I think almost everyone expected him to be. He is getting results. The president wants it passed. He gets it passed.
Yeah, and he's proven to be a little bit like Bruce Lee, where you have to be water first. Some people criticize that and say, oh, you have no firm position. I don't know what you think about anything. We can have that debate. But legislatively, he's done that approach, and that's different than, McCarthy was in these spats. They may not have been of his choosing, but he couldn't get out from under them. He was in public, open warfare with what were admittedly difficult members of the caucus. Matt Gaetz no longer there. But he and Boehner and Paul Ryan before them would have these rolling public battles with those flanks. And Johnson, partly because I say it not with any disrespect, deliberately not trashing him. But you don't really know where he is on these things. And then sooner or later, he tries to land the plane. It's sort of the job. I mean, that's what LBJ did on a very different legislative agenda, one for civil rights and a fair deal. Our guests today, I want to point out on the substance, we talked about the maneuvering, but this cuts, this budget, $1 trillion out of Medicaid, $150 billion from Medicare and Obamacare, 10 to 12 million people booted off coverage. And that is a direct, obvious breaking of Donald Trump's vow, meaning what he said before, if he knew he was going to do this, were outright lies, including to his own supporters.
Can you guarantee that Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security will not be touched?
Yeah, I mean, I have said it so many times. We're not going to touch it. We will not cut Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid benefits. We're not cutting Medicaid, we're not cutting Medicare, and we're not cutting Social Security.
So what do I tell 663,000 people in 2 years or 3 years when President Trump breaks his promise by pushing them off of Medicaid?
The last voice, one of the Republican defectors, Doug Brinkley, it's very clear there that Donald Trump's mastery of PR and politics is these are widely unpopular plans, including on the right. So he broke a promise or was lying the whole time. How important is that as we live in an era where people want to retreat to their own spin or facts? But the fact is he broke that vow.
It's going to matter when people get hurt. You know, that all economies go up and down, and it's going to depend Donald Trump's fate or the fate of 2026 and what our economy does. But what's shocking to me is that Trump is the one carrying out the sledgehammer to the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson, going after really Medicaid, Medicare, PBS, NPR, Wild and Scenic Rivers, after school programs, going after, so-called food stamp programs, as they used to be called. He's the one, he's the avenger. And that he's pulling off it's really quite stunning.
So every president has a big legislative priority that they want to get done in their first year. The first year is always the pivotal time where you can push big pieces of legislation forward. And regardless of party or ideology or the merits of the ideas, the basic question that drives it for every single one of them is typically pretty simple. What's the problem you want to solve? Maybe it was a problem you inherited. Maybe it's making good on a campaign promise. Maybe it's a crisis nobody saw coming that's now sitting in your lap because you're the president. I mean, I worked for 2 presidents, and that's how it went for them, but that's how it has gone for pretty much every president for decades. Obama's first 18 months were focused around getting the Recovery Act passed because his priority at the time was digging the country out of the huge economic hole, the massive unemployment rate crisis that was created by the 2008 financial meltdown. He also fought to pass Dodd-Frank, a Wall Street reform package, to address the problems that had led to the financial crisis. And of course, he pushed very, very, very hard for the Affordable Care Act because far too many Americans lacked health insurance. He was solving clear problems, pulling the country out of an economic hole, trying to prevent it from happening again, trying to give people health insurance who didn't have it. Fast forward to when Joe Biden took office. That was the height of a global pandemic. And his focus was, of course, on delivering a rescue plan to help address the economic damage it was causing and to help get all sorts of equipment out to people, whether it was tests or masks or things to help people address and prevent them from getting COVID. That was his focus. He also signed a giant bill into law that addressed the country's infrastructure needs, something way overdue. Remember the infrastructure week that was in Trump's first term, seemingly every week? Well, Joe Biden actually did it. And then he passed another law that tackled inflation and the climate crisis. He was trying to answer questions, trying to address the COVID crisis, but also address problems he had long wanted to solve. Outdated infrastructure in our country, the need to do more for the climate. Those were clear questions. That's what they were trying to do. In every case, and more cases than those, presidents identified problems that were impacting huge, broad swaths of the country. And then they worked with Congress to try to solve them. Which brings me to a big unanswered question about Donald Trump's big ugly bill. which now heads to his desk after passing by the narrowest of margins this afternoon. What exactly is the problem this legislation is trying to solve? What exactly did Donald Trump and his team sit in a room and think, you know what, we have two houses of Congress, we have the White House, we're going to try to solve this big problem? Republicans have never even tried to answer that question, not coherently at least. But looking what is in the bill, it's pretty clear to me that the problem they were seeking to address is, I guess, that the wealthy in this country have too little and they pay too much in taxes and the poor have too much. It's the only thing that makes sense. And yeah, that question and focusing your big legislative priorities on answering that question is completely at odds with the often repeated theory that Donald Trump is somehow a champion of working people. I mean, we have all, probably everybody watching right now, I definitely do, have all long known that this is a farce. But now, with his signature legislation headed to his desk, there should be no doubt. Trump is no populist. A populist doesn't kick 17 million people off their health care coverage. Populist doesn't take food stamps away from millions of people. Populist doesn't fund a massive immigration enforcement army with a budget bigger than many of the world's militaries. And a populist definitely doesn't do all of that while also giving over $4 trillion in tax cuts to corporations and the wealthiest people in the entire country. This is Donald Trump's signature piece of legislation. It's the chance he had, as president, to solve a problem in this country at a time when, by the way, real problems need a lot of solving. Many people who voted for him were betting he was going to do something to help them. And yet those are the people who voted for him, who sent him to the Oval Office, many of whom will be hit the hardest by this legislation. I mean, Trump made huge electoral gains in counties with lots of voters on Medicaid, probably in part because he explicitly pledged never to cut Medicaid. Well, he just broke that promise to all those voters. And some of them don't even know it yet. Some of them still have no idea what Trump and Republicans in Congress have just done. Polling shows that many Americans have not even heard about this giant bill at all. And of those who have, only a sliver know it includes Medicaid cuts. And that is definitely a challenge for Democrats. And we're going to talk about that with a few of my guests tonight, because it kind of is the question now. But here's the thing. The more people learn about what is in this bill, the less they like the bill and all the components of it. And the people who do know what is in the bill are pissed.
In Danville today, people voiced their frustration with President Donald Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill. Say Medicaid! Loud and clear across the street from their congressman's office.
Dozens gathered outside Representative David Valadao's office. Their message to the congressman: vote no on what the protesters call deadly cuts to health care.
Protesters tonight on Dodge Street pleading for Nebraska's representatives to have a change of heart. Frustration mounts as a massive federal budget bill hits the House floor.
In congressional districts all across Georgia Tuesday, constituents demonstrated against President Trump's spending bill.
The organization of Monday's Stop the Billionaire Giveaway Bus Tour says those in favor of this bill aren't looking at its harmful effects to the greater population, such as Medicaid restrictions, food assistance, and rollback tax credits on clean energy.
Everything you just saw, that package of protests across the country from all over the place, is just from the past 3 days. And there were more. Protesters showed up in Tucson outside the office of Republican Congressman Juan Kiscomani and outside Republican Congresswoman Young Kim's office in Anaheim. In Staten Island, protesters held what they called a die-in, that's what they called it, outside the offices of Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis. They brought homemade tombstones representing the lives impacted by Trump's big, ugly bill. And the protests are only gaining steam. Tomorrow, there are more than 200 Free America protests planned across the country. Organizers say those protests will be focused on freeing the U.S. from billionaires' power, poverty, unlawful orders, and the politics of fear. And those protesters understand how important it is to bring the ugliness of this bill into the light of day. That is the focus now. What we are seeing now is the beginning, just the beginning, of an effort to make sure every Republican who voted for this owns that vote. And it's not going to take one speech, even a good one, or one protest. It's not going to happen in one day or 1 week or even 1 month. That effort will need to be absolutely relentless and specifically tied to the impact this bill has on the people those Republicans represent. And it's going to take the people who fought against it, too, also being relentless, tirelessly reminding people of the damage these Republicans just did with this bill.
Today, Donald Trump spoke by phone with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin for roughly an hour.
We had a call. It was a pretty long call. We talked about a lot of things, including Iran. And we also talked about, as you know, the war with Ukraine. And I'm not happy about that. I'm not happy.
Did you have any progress with him on a deal with Ukraine? Do you feel like you made any progress?
No, I didn't make any progress with him today at all.
Unusually self-aware comment from Donald Trump. After the call, Putin's foreign policy advisor, Yuri Ushakov, released this statement. There was a detailed discussion of the situation surrounding Iran and the state of affairs in the Middle East in general. The Russian side emphasized it was crucial to settle any and all contentious issues, differences, and conflicts exclusively via political and diplomatic means. The conversation between the two presidents has, as always, shown that they are on the same page. The two presidents will naturally continue communicating and will have another conversation soon, end quote. Trump and Putin are on the same page, says Putin's advisor. Axios reports Ushakov also told reporters Trump stressed during the call that he wants to end the war between Russia and Ukraine swiftly. Putin told Trump that Russia is not going to give up on its goals in Ukraine. Ushakov said, adding that Russia sees its peace talks with Ukraine as a bilateral issue that the U.S. shouldn't be actively involved in. So Trump wants to end the war swiftly. Putin says it's not going to give up on its goals and that the U.S. shouldn't be actively involved. This call happened just 2 days after the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, blocked the delivery of Patriot missiles to Ukraine, missiles already approved and paid for under the Biden administration. Now, these air defense systems are vital to Ukraine's ability to defend itself. Ukraine's deputy foreign minister says the delay, quote, would only encourage the aggressor to continue the war and terror rather than to seek peace, end quote. The aggressor, in case this has become confusing in the Trump administration, is Russia. Putin is already acting on that advantage. The Kremlin has intensified airstrikes on Ukraine, and the Wall Street Journal reports that Russia has massed 50,000 troops near the Ukrainian border city of Sumy, where they outnumber the Ukrainians roughly 3-1, according to soldiers who are fighting there. The New York Times reports that Trump has issued no new sanctions against Russia related to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In some cases, the administration has eased restrictions. The results has created an opening for new dummy companies to funnel funds and critical components to Russia, including computer chips and military equipment that would otherwise be cut off to the Kremlin. Donald Trump is letting Russia rebuild. He's withholding critical aid to Ukraine. He's easing sanctions. He's holding pointless calls with Putin in which Trump has not been able to persuade Putin of anything. It all adds up to a glaring green light from Donald Trump to Russia's dictator, basically saying the United States is not going to stand in your way. Trump has undermined our allies and betrayed the principles that once defined American leadership in the world. Joining me now is Michael McFaul, who served as the U.S. ambassador to Russia from 2012 to 2014. He's an MSNBC international affairs analyst. Ambassador, good to see you again. I was actually kind of impressed that Donald Trump said to the reporters he got nothing done in this call, because the rest of us have been watching this show unfold for a while, realizing that Donald Trump is getting nothing done with Vladimir Putin except giving him permission to continue his aggression in Ukraine.
Well, I agree. If you're looking for some good news amongst a lot of bad news with respect to this horrific invasion and attacking of civilians today, and it just escalated since we've been in the last couple hours here, that's it. But then what does he do with that?
Yeah.
Okay, he now has diagnosed the problem. Putin's not listening to him. Putin's not even, this amazing thing that Mr. Ushakov said, somebody I used to deal with closely, that we don't want you to be involved in any negotiations now. Well, that is just saying you are weak, President Trump. We don't care what you want to do. So now what is the president going to do about it? Because we look weak. This incredibly poor decision by the Department of Defense to not deliver these Patriot systems, like you said, already paid for, approved by the U.S. Congress, that is a signal of weakness. And what I don't understand about a guy that seems so obsessed with looking tough, with looking strong, is why does President Trump allow Putin to make him look so weak?
You know, in my tours in Ukraine, we would see interceptions of Russian missiles coming in, and the intercepting anti-missile, the interceptions. It's one of the few reasons why Russia doesn't have air control over Ukraine. And it's really important, because if that were to not be the case, it would be very hard for the Ukrainians to continue to mount a legitimate defense.
You're exactly right. And this is the one weapon system, the Patriots, that's what we're talking about, and the interceptors that are depleted now. It's the one system that they need us, the United States, to have. They've done a lot of creative things, as you know, with drones, making all kinds of weapons productions, buying weapons now, getting weapons from the Europeans. The Europeans now provide, in the aggregate, more military assistance to Ukraine than we do. But when we're talking about missile defenses, and particularly the Patriot system, that's what they need us for. And that's what, tragically, the Trump administration, with no explanation, by the way, talking to the Congress about it, decided to pause 2 days ago.
I want to bring up something. Reuters was reporting about Vladimir Putin's discussion with Emmanuel Macron, the first time those two have talked in nearly 3 years. But it's important. On Ukraine, Putin reiterated his position to Macron that the war was a direct consequence of the West's policy, which he said had ignored Russia's security interests over the past few years. Any possible peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine should have a comprehensive and long-term character and be based on new territorial realities, the Kremlin quoted Putin as saying. This was the argument used at the beginning of the war, that this war is your fault, that you, NATO, even though Ukraine's not a member of NATO, you pushed up against our borders, you pushed us back, you hemmed us in. Vladimir Putin is stuck on that, is never going to be unstuck on that.
Tragically, that's right. And let's just be crystal clear. There was no threat to Russia when Putin decided to invade Ukraine. No threat, absolutely. No NATO country has ever attacked the Soviet Union or Russia. And as you just underscored, Ukraine was not a member of NATO when they were invaded. But that phrase, new territorial realities, that means that he wants to take parts of Ukraine. That is an imperial design that he somehow wants the West to recognize. And I know that President Macron will never do that. I hope President Trump also will never do that.
Ambassador, good to see you as always. Thank you for being with us. The former United States Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul.